Welcome to week 2 of 1826 Comparative Higher Education. Congratulations, you have stuck with the course and are ready to tackle your compressed spring course. I hope you've had some chance to think about the topics that interest you and the topic that you might want to pursue for your final paper. The sky is the limit with this, anything to do with higher education, from students' experiences to governance to the way new institutions are run or old institutions are shut down. You also have all of history to look at. So there's some really wonderful ways that you can take this paper on. Now that might seem intimidating because the sky is the limit and you do have to narrow your focus. And this week, we're going to tackle in this lecture why we compare and then how we compare. So I'm going to give you some really practical tips for starting your paper and how I want you to work on that proposal. And I want to embed that in the bigger conversations we're having about how we compare and what categories are used to compare. There have been many, many excellent scholars on comparative higher education and comparative education who have sat down to think about what categories should be compared. How do we take different cultures and societies and begin to systematically see what categories can be compared? Sometimes we find that even the name of the thing in education that we want to talk about has a different title in a different place. So I mentioned last week that I work on the 7th floor of Boise, and I'm a research manager for a large-scale survey. And we are one of 32 countries that actually already has given out a survey to faculty. And so we give out a survey to faculty across Canada. I think it went to 34,000 people or something. And then we have a lot of data to work with on what's happening in Canada. But a really exciting part of this study, which is a comparative higher education study, is that throughout the year we get together with teams in other countries to compare our survey and their survey. You can imagine that with 32 countries, even just getting a research tool, a survey questionnaire that can be used in all the contexts was really, really difficult. We had to leave certain categories blank because we couldn't ask a person in Canada the same questions about, for instance, their employment status as you might be able to in Germany. So in Canada, for full-time professors, we typically have 3 categories: an assistant professor who has not yet gained tenure, an associate professor who has gained tenure, and a full professor who has been promoted to the ultimate rank, I guess you'd call it. But that's just not the way it works in every country. Some countries have, you're some sort of research associate for a long time before you get to the rank of professor, which might take an entire career. So if we asked people, are you a professor? That term means something very different in different contexts. And so all the people who have helped inform even the research that I do, they have thought for years and years, these scholars, on how do we compare? And sometimes we can work really hard to make sure that we're comparing apples and apples, that we've got the right terms for professors and what they do, or we have the right ideas of research funding or subjects that students take, that we're asking them what they take and make sure the survey matches. But sometimes as we begin to develop those questions, we find ourselves wanting to ask sort of these deeper, higher order questions. And this brings us to the first idea that I want to get across today, which is, why do we compare? So comparative education, for those of you who have taken the side course, this will be familiar, started about 150 years ago in Europe. And in Europe at that time, the national governments were doing big pushes for compulsory education at the primary and secondary level. There's an incredible book called, I think, Winter Studies and Summer Rambles in Canada, about a British woman who comes to Upper Canada, so that would be the Toronto area, in the 1830s. And she brings with her, as an elite British woman whose husband is working in some level of government, she brings with her this idea that we have to have national systems of education. And she's scandalized that 50% of the men who are in the sort of the administrative council of Upper Canada can't even read. And so there's a big critique now that we think that comparative education started just out of nationalism. But there were different levels. There was absolutely nationalism, and people wanted their countries to be strong and powerful and to fight. But there was an elite group of, often it was women and other educators, who had this philanthropic view of society that all of the citizens would be brought up through education. There was a huge push for that. And then comparative education developed because they began to compare how literacy was doing in England versus Germany, how the Swiss students were taught math compared to how it was taught in Germany. And this comparative science became a refining lens to understand how your country was doing. So that was the origins of comparative education. They compared because they wanted to improve their country. So that's one reason we do compare. And you might find yourself thinking about what you do in your professional practice. Perhaps you administrate you're a coordinator for one of our professions at U of T. How do we accredit law students who have been trained in other countries? And you might want to do a paper saying, how are lawyers who are born elsewhere and trained elsewhere incorporated into other systems? Does Australia do a better job giving foreign credentials, like validating foreign credentials in Canada? And so we develop a paper to refine our own practice to say, I think we could do this better. And that is a huge problem across Canada, are the underemployed status, the underused people who have been trained in other countries but can't get qualified here. And so a comparative study can help us to begin to say, like, maybe we need to change something. Maybe there's a better way of doing this. So that's one of the reasons we compare. Another reason we compare is to deeply understand something, especially when it's a phenomenon that has radically changed social life in some way. I find it fascinating. My whole interest is student mobility, campus mobility, this international exchange of education in an era that people claim is post-colonial. So as education moves around in more of a free trade, free market way, what underlying values and cultures are shifted and shaped? Where is the resistance? Where is their disconnect with the values and the culture of the place that's being imported, or the students that are moving? All of those kind of questions, which have just rolled off my brain, are what I want to deeply understand. Part of the reason I like to deeply understand that is because a lot of my work before I came to OISE was as a coordinator and working with students from other cultures and countries as they begin their academic journey, and to see the disconnect that some of them have and that challenge that they have. So deeply understanding people's experiences can help us as student services professionals to do a better job. So there is that refining of practice, not because we're necessarily comparing because I want to copy what they do, but to deeply understand people so that that human experience can be approved. And a final reason that we compare is for theoretical understanding. So not just to understand the people experience, but to understand larger global historic trends. So when we begin to compare what's happening in Canada, how Canada has shifted, say, and how we fund higher education, and we think that we're the only country doing this. We think it's the only thing in the world that's happening. And we begin to realize other countries have gone through similar cycles or pattern or had similar resistance. And that's where some of our big theories come from on how society works. So to develop a theoretical understanding, which is an explanation for the way that large social things happen, theory can be a really interesting and important part that comes from comparative higher education. And so those are some of the reasons that we compare. Now, as I mentioned last week, we have these two schools that take a bit of a different approach, and you might find yourself gravitating towards one of them: comparative education and comparative higher education. And comparative ed is the one that goes back to the 1850s, that often talked about culture and how we adapt things to suit the national culture of a particular place. And there was a lot of conversation back then about the national character of Switzerland or the national character of Germany in a lot of the European writings. And that's something that actually in Canada we have a difficult time talking about, because we're a diverse society and a diverse population. To talk about like one piece of our national character feels like it's a bit of a blank paintbrush that we're just sort of wiping everyone with the same brush, and that doesn't always feel right to us. But there is, when we talk about context, certain contexts within Canada that can be understood, how people shift and move, how even multiculturalism, the dynamics within that, what works, what doesn't work, how that can shape our education system. So comparative education loves to talk about that: the context, the values, the culture, the character of education and the people involved in it. Comparative higher education often looks at, like the study that I work on what are the government systems, what are the big structures of education, how do we compare them across nations? And there's absolutely a place for that too, especially as we develop policies and need to figure out how our governments do fund education or interact with it. Now I have Dr. Ruth Hayhoe, and you'll see a second video where you can listen to her explain some of the more complex readings from this week. And that's because the other question this week is, how do we compare? And in the additional readings for week 2, you're going to find a lot of scholars. If you're in the research strain, doing a major research paper or heading towards a thesis, you will have to justify why you compare in a certain way. Why did you decide to look at power dynamics between parents and students as they head to post-secondary education? you can just invent that and make your own rationale sometimes, but often you want to anchor it and say, these scholars took me this far, and that's why I took this step. So in those readings, you're going to see a lot of different people who suggest different categories to compare. And a few of them, I think Verity is one of them, talk about this universal theories of education. What are the major features that can be compared across countries and contexts? So as I said, Ruth is going to come and explain some of those more theoretical ones. But what I want to ask you is, how are you planning to organize your paper? You'll notice that one of the assignments you have due is a paper proposal. I have designed the portfolio activities to help build your analytic skills. I use that, the learning portfolio, in all my classes, but I actually developed it for this class because I found that if students didn't organize their paper very well ahead of time, the whole thing is difficult to read on one end, but also doesn't have the depth that they could have had if they just begin to systematically think about the categories of comparison. How do we compare? So I'm going to give you a few examples and a framework, a chart, because I love charts, on that you can use to hand in your proposal. You'll have two different ways that you can hand in the proposal. One is a chart option. And then, because not all of us learn the same way, there is a Word document option that you can fill in as well. So when you begin to plan your paper, I want you to use a template like this. You can obviously adapt it to your own ideas and your own needs. That's why I give you a lot of different sort of analytic ideas and options in the portfolios. I want you to use what works with your brain, what helps you to organize your thoughts. But this is one helpful way, and here's a template that you can use to organize your paper. And the first thing we always need to do with any good research paper is get a solid question. So for this example, I've taken the research question: what are the rationales, the new policies, and the outcomes of higher education funding reforms in France and Quebec in the last 30 years? Now, I've added a time frame at the end, and for those of you who have taken a class with me before, or those who have watched some of the resource videos with librarians at the bottom of the module section, you'll notice that timeframes is one of the things the librarian suggests. Some people get kind of bogged down with this. So if you just want to look at sort of contemporary stuff that's happened in the last 20 years, you don't have to put a time frame in your question. But what we want to see in this research question is that I'm trying to figure out, how have governments changed the way that they fund higher ed? Why did they do it? And what were the outcomes? So then I have to figure out where I want to look at this. Well, I have a really big interest in countries that have a colonial history with each other. So I'm actually comparing here a province and a country, and that's a possibility. But you have to have a rationale for why you are choosing that, okay? You're going to see in the Word document template that I give you that you need to have a rationale for why you chose the locations. It has to make sense on some level. They have to be comparing things that can be compared. So one of the jokes is that you can't take Canada, all of Canada, and then compare it to some tiny little country that's only 2 square feet, but is like totally full of people. It has a totally different federal system or something like that, unless you really want to justify it. So Canada compares to some countries and doesn't compare to others well. But provinces within Canada can often be good comparisons because, of course, our provinces are in charge of higher education. So when you look at how funding has changed, if you look at a provincial level, you're going to begin to see something that can be compared with many of the European countries which are funded from federal levels. And that's okay. So in this, we've got comparative categories down the left. What were the reforms and when were the reforms? What were the rationales? What drove these reforms? What was the relationship to the broader region? So I've added this because we know that France is part of the EU and Quebec is part of Canada. And so because they both have this relationship to a larger region, I want to look at that in some of the research I do. What are the major higher education trends that are happening around that might have influenced this? The importance of research, STEM subjects, differentiation, internationalization, some of these issues. What was happening in the government or in society at the time that this happened? Were there protest movements against immigration? Was there a huge deficit? Was there a war? Like sort of things that we want to begin to ask. What was the context in the country at that time? And then, of course, what were the results? What were the intended results and what were the unintended results? Now, I have just made this paper up without doing any research. And so what you can imagine is that as I begin to look at all of the different sources and begin to read up on this. And there will be great readings on France in the week, and the additional readings for the week on Europe. And that would just start a paper like this quite easily without having to go into research, those curated articles for you already. But as I look at this, I begin to read, I begin to say, oh, you know what? I'm going to take out that one on broader trends or the broader region. I'm going to actually put in this question, this category instead. And then as I take my data, I'm going to start to type it in. What were the rationales? Oh, well, in France, there was a major war with Germany. That's not true. And then in Quebec, oh, right, there was the economic collapse of whatever. Actually, that would probably fit into the broader society things. The rationales might be that we need to save money, or that we just had a huge expansion of student population. We need to accommodate more students. And so you'll see that I did an imperfect job putting the data into the categories, but that's the ongoing process that you keep refining. Should I have this category? Oh, I read this paper. I just realized that this is an actually important category. And then you begin to put the data in your chart for both locations. And when you write your paper, these categories become your paragraphs. So you will have headings that say relationship with the broader region or regional connections. You will have headings that say intended results, unintended results. Let's go on to the next example. Here's my research question. What were the motives, the events, and outcomes of student protest movements in Brazil, Russia, and the USA in the 1960s and 1970s? And remember, in your paper, you'll have to justify, why did you choose these locations? So what were the main events? What were the main protests or riots or petitions that happened? What were the motives for the students? What groups were involved? Both the different types of student groups, maybe labor movements, government groups, was the military involved? What was the government response? What was the military response? What was the institutional response? Did universities themselves take some agency in changing things? What was the global response? Were new networks formed? Were there any relationship between these countries during these protest times? Now, in these categories that I've just sort of invented, again, as I read more articles, I'll be able to refine these, take some out and say, oh, this is the really important question. In fact, protest movements take a lot of money. I don't think they really do, but who was funding it? Who was funding the other side? So you might find that you add a category on financing in there because of some articles you've read. Now, I've highlighted a last question down there. It says, what was the underlying belief about education that drove this? If you're in a research strain, and if you're really trying to flex your comparative muscles in this class, I want you to think about some of these higher order questions, these sort of like philosophical context questions. The rationale may have been the students didn't feel they had enough money. But sometimes when we begin to read some authors, they're going to give us a deeper sense of what was driving these students in terms of the philosophical belief. Sometimes it's a belief that education should be free. So huge protest movements, even as recently as 10 years ago in Europe about tuition. Brazil had some very recently as well about whether they would charge tuition or not. And a lot of those sort of creakings and strainings of society indicate what values are being reshaped, the value of free education or the value of, say, entrepreneurship and personal investment in higher education. So begin to think about some of the higher order questions that might be informing the issue that you are going to study. So let's do one together. All right, here's a question. Let's do vocational education. So I have to develop a question. So I want my who, where, what, why, and when. I would like to know about what vocational education looks like in different countries. So what is the purpose and how is technical vocational education administered in different countries? Something like that. All right. So what is the purpose and the place in society of technical, I do want something about it being administered, like how it's run. What is the purpose and administrative position of technical vocational education, vocational higher education in Ontario, because I'm going to pretend I work at a college. And I'm fascinated about how we do it, because Ontario's colleges are world renowned and have a very well-developed system of how we do technical vocational education. But I want to compare it to a country that I really don't know much about. So I might choose Germany, because Germany is one of the sort of tech strongholds of the world, or I might choose a country in East Asia that's known for really strong technical development, Japan or somewhere like that. And one of the things I was going to sort of say earlier was that one of the ways we compare is to compare what we do in our practice to the place that's like the flagship. As you begin to read the articles, you go, oh, wow, like Germany's looked at as, say, the gold standard, the A+ of technical vocational education. I'll compare what they do to what we do to improve my own practice. But another way to do it is to compare what we do, say, in Ontario to the way that developing countries are doing it, to begin to see, is there something that we, who have so many systems, are just missing in the way that we could do something when we're not trying to do it to the highest, perfectest level, but we're trying to do it in a way that, say, embraces the culture or the values. So just looking at totally different contexts just to try, but you have to justify why you chose it. So I'm going to do Ontario and Germany, and I'm just going to do sort of recent history. So we're just going to say contemporary. So we know that I don't have to really put a time frame in there. The comparative categories. Ooh, what types of institutions are in this technical vocational category? The reason this becomes important, as I mentioned from the work that I'm doing right now, is that I might say, hey, yeah, I'm studying colleges in Canada. Well, as we know, a college in the US is a totally different concept, right? So Ontario's colleges are actually on par with what we call technical vocational institutions in other countries. So we have to figure out, what are they? What's the category? What types of institutions exist? Where do they fit in the broader system? Is there transfer functions, or are they standalone? Do they do research? Do they do research? Because that's often a huge part of our technical institutions. How are they funded? What is their partnership with industry? And then I might do like student focused questions. I don't know, like admission standards, things like that. Admissions, is it a first cycle degree? Is it something like that? Or is this something you do as graduate work? Is this something that stands alone to get you into sort of skill development? Then I'm going to go start reading a whole lot. And I'm going to start changing these categories around. So this is where I want you guys to start for your papers. Now, as I mentioned, not everyone is a chart person as much as I am. And so I want you, if you're a writer, a person who likes to construct things into paragraphs to get all your thoughts out, that's no problem. So I want you to use something like this for your proposal. I want you to get that research question nailed down. I actually typically write 3 to 4 research questions in different formatting, different kind of parameters to help me to narrow it down. And then I want you to tell me about the issue that you're looking at. Are you looking at funding? Why is this important? Why is this something we need to care about? Then pick your comparative locations or your timeframes if you're doing a diachronic analysis. What makes these locations or times good to compare? What makes them comparable? So justify that for me. And then, of course, you're going to list the categories, just like we did in the chart, and begin to tell me a bit of the information that you're finding related to these. Why have you chosen them? And then if you are deciding to do a more theoretical or philosophical question to help explain the data that you're looking at, you can add that in as well. There are more details on master's and PhD requirements in the assignments tab for the number of sources you need and sort of how long this should be. So please follow that. But know that you can do this in one of 2 ways. Either is an option. And as you begin to do some of the readings for this week, looking at slaughter, looking at homes, they're going to give you some broad ways to try to tackle comparison and what things are important for us to consider as we compare. Holmes is particularly interesting, and I actually I find students love it or hate it that we're going through Holmes. That's why I brought Ruth in. Holmes was her supervisor when she did her PhD back in the day in London. But the reason I think you need to know it is because I think we can get very pragmatic, and that's how I work typically. It's like, all right, I've got this survey. I want to know about working conditions. I want to know about the research funding that professors get. Whereas Holmes was trying to get at the underlying cultural understanding and through his ideal types, which is of course borrowing from Weber. So to hear Ruth talk about the way that she was educated in comparison, it's very rich and it's very deep. And I think for many of you, this might really trigger something. For others, you might be like, this is way over my head. And actually that's okay. Think of it as just letting stuff wash over you. And bit by bit, the pieces will come together, whether it's in this course or another course. Don't be intimidated by the depth of these readings. Just take in what you can and let the explanation kind of wash over you. From here, you are going to watch Ruth's talk on some of the more complex readings. You're going to pick the readings you'd like to do, get prepped for your learning portfolio, and begin to think of that topic that's percolating in your mind. There's so many topics in comparative higher education. And as always, if you need to consult with me on your paper, you want a one-to-one meeting, I will have some office hours available. Please reach out. We can go back and forth by email if you're busy. We can meet on Zoom, either way. So have a great week and keep in touch.